When I build my own decks, I often come up with a situation where I have spent 14 out of my possible 15 influence. And I need to ask myself this question: what should I spend the final influence on? If you have built your own decks before, you probably encountered the same problem as me. And so, you probably would have the answer. But for those of you who are not that experienced in deck building, I can share with you my experiences in dealing with this one influence shortage. Now, let's start with the Corp side. The Corp side is way easier because there are many more viable one influence cards that are actually good, useful in most decks. First and foremost, there is always the big old J God. If you don't have 3 copies of him in your deck, either you are trying to be really way off the wall or you're doing something wrong. So, assuming that you already have maxed out your 3 copies of Jackson Howard, what else is there that you can spend your influence on? Well, in order of merit, starting with the best, there's always Eli 1.0. Now, Eli is such a reliable option and always a good include. It's a perfect way to round off your 15 influence suite. It's a piece of ice, which pretty much every deck needs, so you don't have to worry about that. And the fact is that right now in the current meta game, almost everybody uses Corroder as their main factor, and it costs 4 whole credits to break a 3 res cost Eli 1.0. So Eli is definitely by far the best option if you are looking to round off your influence suite and you don't run 3 copies of Eli already. Failing that, there is the ambient event operation, close accounts. Now, this is entirely a meta call. If you are in a meta that faces many runners that are running siphons, whether it be criminals or other factions splashing account siphon, you would want to have close accounts to deal with that. Not only to bring them back to 0, effectively nullifying the siphon, but more importantly to open up scoring windows for yourself, which I demonstrated with my own Nisei Division deck. Having even a singleton close accounts in your deck allows you to achieve that. You won't be able to reliably close their accounts right after they siphon, but if they choose to float tags and they get close if their accounts get closed even once, they'll find it quite hard to climb back up, and that might be all the space you need. So that is a very good way to spend your one influence. Now, failing that, there's green level clearance. This used to be the staple go-to one influence something that you spend your one influence on. But as more and more data packs were released and as corps gain way more economic options, nowadays most corps are able to sustain their own economy within using economy cards within their own faction. So there's rarely any need to turn to things like green level clearance or the like, basically. But it's still a good source of card draw. There are not that many sources of card draw for the corps, and green level clearance allows you to basically thin out your deck a bit more by allowing you to draw your cards faster, which might be of help to certain deck types. And finally, there's Corporate Troubleshooter, which is only useful if you have ice that severely damages the runner, be it through net damage, brain damage, or trashing the programs. Otherwise, you won't find any need for this. As a one-off, it's a pretty good card. The only problem is that it can be trash, so it actually weakens your R&D that much more. But otherwise, it's a good way to spend your last influence point. So corps have quite a lot of options. Most of them are in HB, but as a HB player, close accounts is always a good thing to spend your influence on. The question is, what if you're a runner? For the runner side, it's much more tricky because the one influence cards are really not all that great. Most of them are marginal, if not completely niche. They only apply to very specific deck types. So let's see what are some of the better options that are available still. If you are not an Anarch, you can look for these cards with recurring credits, which will pay themselves off and even net you a lot of savings if you install them early game and you go to the late game. Scrubber is a meta call against asset-heavy decks, but actually works well for pretty much any deck. It threatens to trash Jackson for 1, which is very good, and in a meta that is heavy with Sand Sands, it trashes Sand Sands for 3, which is also fantastic. So with Scrubber, I don't think you can really go wrong in this current meta. As for Cyber Feeder, you can use it to pay for icebreakers, and come on, everyone uses icebreakers. So how bad can this be? The recurring credit will add up over time, and soon it will become worth it. As long as you're running a deck that goes on to the mid or late game, Cyber Feeder will more or less be guaranteed to pay itself off. And to double up, it also serves as a good form of shutdown prevention, protection to prevent your corroder from being shut down, which is quite important for criminals. Alright, but the card that trumps them all would be Data Sucker, in my opinion. This is especially applicable to very early game aggressive decks, most criminal decks basically. Those decks that look to run often and make lots of successful runs. Data Sucker is the go-to card. It's essentially a Desperado that costs only 1 credit to install and takes up only 1 influence. You should be running 3 of those if you are really running this aggressively. But otherwise, if you are just trying to fill out your influence suite, a single Data Sucker can actually do more magic than you think it might. And it actually gives the Corp a reason to purge virus counters, meaning you can actually slow the Corp down just by playing this card that costs 1 credit. It's absolutely amazing, and it really should be worth more than 1 influence, but since it's not, abuse it. Alright, so moving on to the non-criminal factions that look to splash that 1 influence criminal card. The card that I would usually splash for 1 influence would be Compromise Employee. Ideally, you want to have 3 of these in your deck if you're even running it, because you want to see early game. You don't want to play a Compromise Employee mid to late game. It becomes a dead card by then, because by then you won't be running traces and there will be less ice that the Corp will res that gains you that credit. But otherwise, it's a nice way to splash, and if you see it early, you can always play it and it will net you a lot of money over time. Ultimately, I think the better card would be Gorman Drip. Again, another program, another virus. It's so great because, like Data Sucker, it costs 1 credit to install, meaning that it also does shutdown prevention. It protects your corroders, your Zuki Masters, and so on. Oh, clone chips as well, that's pretty important. Yeah. Instead of rewarding you for making lots of successful runs like Data Sucker does, what Gorman Drip does is it punishes the Corp for drawing cards or for manually clicking for credits. And this can be really huge when added up over time. I think that's not the scariest part of it. The scariest part is just the intimidation factor that it poses to the Corp. The Corp will be so scared to draw cards when they should be drawing, scared to click for credits when they should be clicking. And so this intimidation factor alone can actually swing games heavily in your favor, even though it might not provide the biggest burst of credits. But hey, it's a fantastic card and it should definitely be considered so long as you have the memory space for it. Now moving on to the non-Shaper 1 influence cards. Unfortunately, as you can see, there aren't that many of them. Shaper isn't really the faction to look for when you're going to splash 1 influence cards because they all pretty much suck. The best that they have to offer is Quality Time, a rare form of card draw and a huge card draw. In fact, drawing 5 cards with 1 click, that's huge. The biggest problem with this card is obviously the 3 play costs, which most Anarchs can barely afford. Anarchs are pretty poor in general, and they really don't want to be spending 3 credits to draw cards, but since Anarchs don't have very good card drawing faction, aside from Wildside, Quality Time is usually their go-to card for rounding off their influence suites. For criminals and shapers, they typically look towards Anarchs to round off their influence suite by using Data Sucker, or in the case of shapers, since they can tutor programs mid-run, Stim Hack might be a good choice too. A singleton Stim Hack will give at most 1 brain damage to yourself, meaning that you will still be safe from Scorched Earth, single Scorched Earth without plus crit. And otherwise, Gorman Drip is also a fine choice if you are looking to stretch the game out a little longer. So yes, that's basically it for the runner side. Again, none of these are particularly good, and as you can see, the runner side hasn't really benefited much from the spin cycle when it comes to 1 influence cards. That's to be expected, I guess, because most of the spin cycle cards on the runner side just aren't that good. So the next time you build your deck, these might be helpful considerations to think about when you are looking to round off your influence suite. Of course, you still have to ask yourself the question, would I rather have 1 of these cards that I'm showing you in this video, or would I rather use the deck space for other stuff that I actually need in my deck? That is something important to consider. For Corps, it's more of a no-brainer because every deck needs ice, and Eli is always a good piece of ice in the current meta. For runners, not the same case. You might want your core programs, all your money, resources, and etc. Well, thanks for watching. Hopefully my explanation of everything wasn't too complicated. Sorry if it was. This is my first take and I don't intend to do any future takes. Well, hope you understood everything that went on and happy deck building yourself. It's a pretty fun process and I'm sure you learned something out of it. See you around.